When we think about the American Revolution, our minds usually jump to these huge battles or the famous founding fathers. But for the actual people living back then, this wasn't just some chapter in a history book. It was a real, life-altering choice. A choice that would define everything for them, their families, and really the future of an entire continent. So let's frame this whole explainer around that one single question. I want you to imagine it's the 1770s. Things are getting heated. You absolutely have to choose a side. So, who will you become? All right, let's get right into it. The American colonies were at a total breaking point. The debate was raging everywhere, in the town squares, in the pubs, around the dinner table, and it was all about one thing. Who are we, and who are we loyal to? Are you going to stick with the British crown, or are you going to risk absolutely everything for a new, totally uncertain future? And out of this massive debate, two main groups started to form, basically forcing everyone to make a choice. You were either a loyalist or you were a patriot. And believe me, there was not a lot of room to be in the middle. So let's break down what these two sides actually believed. On one hand, you've got the loyalists. For them, being loyal to England meant stability, it meant order. A lot of them had business ties to Britain, or they worked for the royal government. They really believed in the British system and were terrified that a rebellion would just lead to total chaos and pretty much destroy the life they knew. But then you have the patriots. They felt like their basic rights as English citizens were just being stomped on. The Loyalists saw them as dangerous rebels, but they were ready to fight for complete independence and what they called equal treatment. So this was the choice. And you have to understand, this wasn't some abstract political debate. It was a deeply personal decision between the safety and security of being part of the most powerful empire in the world and the completely unknown, incredibly dangerous path of revolution. To get a real feel for what it meant to actually choose the patriot path, let's zoom in on one of the most famous and frankly most radical groups of the whole era, the Sons of Liberty. Now, these guys were not stuffy politicians debating in powdered wigs. Oh no. The Sons of Liberty were the activists on the street. They were the agitators. They'd get together in public, often around these symbolic liberty trees, to organize their protests and really fire people up against British rule. And they did not hold back. Listen to how they described themselves, a group of ragtag patriots. And they made it crystal clear who their enemy was, the tyrant King George. To them, Parliament was just completely out of touch, and they were more than ready to shout about it. But here's the thing. Their methods didn't stay the same. As their frustration with England just kept growing and growing, their tactics evolved in a huge way. They went from simple protests to, well, something much more extreme. So, at first, they tried to keep things peaceful. They organized boycotts of English goods, which was a pretty smart move. They were hitting the British Empire right where it hurt, in the wallet. The whole idea was to use economic pressure to make them listen. And a huge part of that was something called civil disobedience, which is really just a fancy way of saying you refuse, peacefully, to follow laws that you think are fundamentally unjust. Like, say, not paying a tax you believe is unfair. But from their point of view, it just wasn't working. It felt like nobody was listening. The king and parliament kept pushing new taxes, kept ignoring their demands. And for the Sons of Liberty, that meant it was time to take things to the next level. And you can see this really clear escalation. It starts with boycotts, economic pressure. Then it moves to civil disobedience, breaking unjust laws. And when that didn't work, they crossed a major line into straight-up violence. And for the Loyalists, this was their worst nightmare come to life. This was proof that the Patriots weren't freedom fighters. They were just dangerous mobs trying to tear everything down. And the violence? It was brutal. Tarring and feathering wasn't just a prank. It was a horrifying, humiliating attack meant to terrorize tax collectors and scare them into quitting. This was mob justice, pure and simple. The exact thing the Loyalists were so afraid of. And it just shows you how incredibly high the stakes had become. So what was it? What was the big idea that was driving these guys to do such extreme things? What could possibly justify this kind of violence in their minds? Well, it all boiled down to this one very simple question. The colonists were being taxed by a government thousands of miles away, a parliament where they didn't have a single person representing them. For them, this wasn't just unfair. It was a violation of their rights as Englishmen. And they boiled all that frustration down into one of the most powerful and memorable slogans in all of history. No taxation without representation. This was never just about the money. It was about the fundamental right to have a say in how you are governed. That idea, that was the spark. That was the spark that lit the fire of the revolution. It brought everyone together, from the wealthy merchants in Boston to the farmers down in Virginia. It was the core belief that would eventually be woven right into the fabric of a new country, the United States. Which brings us right back to where we started. Now that you've seen the arguments, the passion, the anger, the way things went from protest to real violence, think about it one more time. If you were faced with that choice, loyalty to an old, powerful empire versus the dangerous, bloody birth of a new idea, who would you have become?